Dear Brother, with Alex and Mark, is brought to you by absolutely no one.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Alex.
How are you?
I'm well, I guess.
How are
It's been a fairly stressful couple of weeks.
Yeah, so I'm quite curious about the Colorado thing, the fires particularly.
Okay. Well, state
I
is
have
burning.
questions.
State is
Yes.
burning. We are currently there's typically in the past there were fire seasons in the West, and what that means is that for a period of time during basically the summer and a little bit into early fall, it would be dry enough and the wind would be such that fires would be not only more common, but they would also tend to grow more readily. And so as of the last couple of years, the saying basically is fire season is all year round, which is functionally true. We've had wildfires to some degree every single month of the year, depending upon the year. This year's a little bit interesting. It's bigger and more than it ever has been before. We have, I believe, as of yesterday, the three largest fires by a very large margin burned in the last 2 months or 3 months, give or take. And two of the largest fires have now surpassed the number one largest fire by a very large margin in just the last month and a half or so. One of which actually grew from about 30,000 acres to 130,000 acres in one overnight 12-hour period, which is pretty freaking terrifying because you can't outrun that. That's one of those where if you didn't already leave, then you're done, because there's the speed with which that moves is faster than our vehicles can go, roughly. So as of this recording, it is currently 7 degrees, 77% humidity, calm winds, and snowing lightly at my home, which is about 35 miles south of the nearest fire, for which I understand currently it's about the same conditions, except it's snowing a lot more because the storm is coming from like the northeast, or rather the northwest, actually headed down toward me. So it's hit that area first, which is good. But yeah, no, it's currently unprecedented. And yesterday morning here in town, we had apparently somebody decided they were going to go off into the woods and have a campfire. And as you can imagine, on a red flag day, that was terrifying. And that campfire escaped whatever. It wasn't even in a ring. It was just somebody in the woods basically lighting fire. And so we got called on a report of a wildfire, and thankfully we were able to keep it to less than 1/10 of an acre before the winds kicked in, because otherwise that would have been it. So good times. So yeah, that's.
So in that scenario, did you catch the person who did that? Can they be prosecuted for starting a fire on what did you call it, a red flag day?
Yeah, red flag day is basically it's a National Weather Service alert for what is fire weather. And fire weather is low humidity, relatively high temperatures, and relatively high winds. So those three components, when they get to a certain extreme, they trigger what's called fire weather warnings. And they have different stages of warning, red flag being it's going to burn. Like today, it will burn.
Right.
In this case, the human who apparently lit the fire was not found, may have run away before anybody arrived. And generally speaking, yes, it's a fine-based thing, especially on a red flag day, where I don't know how it works, because our county the county and the state are all under burn bans, which means that there's varying degrees of not allowed to make things that make fire anymore. And so when those days, or when that is the case, if you are caught burning, you receive a summons, basically. It's basically a speeding ticket for being an idiot. And, depending upon the scenario that follows, it can be a very steep fine, or it can be like $100 if you're caught. So it's really not a sufficiently good deterrent. But then again, I can't imagine what would be a sufficiently good deterrent for any human being who believes it is a good idea to light a fire in what is basically a waiting tinderbox on a windy, dry day, surrounded by the largest fires in the history of the Northern Hemisphere. I don't think that person can know anything, because if they don't know that is a bad idea, how could they understand that a fine is a bad idea? And even if they were caught and arrested and locked in a jail, it didn't prevent what they did.
True, but hopefully it'll deter future idiots from.
It's that's the thing I don't quite grasp, because if the current state of what's going on around us isn't enough of a deterrent, and I can't imagine what would be. Like, I don't, how an individual can be sufficiently unconscious to please see the last podcast. how an individual can be sufficiently unconscious to go ahead and just light a fire like that, in these conditions. It sort of means to me that there is no amount of enforcement or consequence that would be, big enough. That just doesn't compute. Like, whoever that person was, whoever they were, and whatever it is that they thought they were doing, could have very easily have caused the evacuation of several thousand homes and the destruction of many hundreds of homes, and potentially the death of several people, if not more, just based on whatever it is they felt they were doing with themselves. So even if it's not intentional, it is exceptionally reckless.
Yeah, it's just dumb.
Yeah.
So, question, as someone who lives up in the mountains, do you have, or do people up there have insurance for this? Like, is there fire insurance? Like here on the island, if you live by the water, there's obviously flood insurance for storms and whatnot. I'm just curious if that exists up for you folk.
It does. It's sort of like, and I actually don't know if this is still the case anymore, but or at least what the case is. There's a level of, I guess, risk where certain properties can no longer be insured. And so I've been very fortunate with my insurance company, is that they have not given me a hard time about my insurance. Because yes, if my house were to burn in a fire, I would receive insurance money for basically the replacement value of my home, which is meaningless because the property that I live on is large enough that my house is a fraction of the cost of what I actually paid for it. So right. Like, I'd be able to like put like a really nice tent back if they paid me out, which may not be so bad. Some neighbors that I have had difficulty with their insurance companies, and it very much has to do with the way in which your house is situated and how it is protected or not. So, for instance, I have cement siding in my house, so it's fireproof. I have a metal roof, which is fireproof. I have what's called defensible space. It's a large area of cleared vegetation around my house. And I have taken quite a lot of effort over the last 4 years to mitigate the risk on my property by removing deadfall, limbing trees up to 8 feet, taking down trees that are either dead or too close to one another to try to reduce the spread potential if something were to come through. So by doing those things, I have protected my property, one, from potentially catching fire if a wildfire were to come through here. But I've also increased the chances of the fire department being able to defend the house, because a lot of it has to do with whether or not you can save a house.
Right.
If a wildfire is going through an area and you're driving down a dirt road and you've got houses on either side of you, and you've got one house on your right and it's got wood shingles and it's deep in the trees and there's tall grass right up to the house, the house is gone. You can't, even if you wanted to, even if you had all the water in the world, you wouldn't go down there and you wouldn't try to save that house. Whereas directly across the street, you might have a house like I just described mine is, you would go and save it.
Interesting.
And it's because it's a matter of, it's like a triage scenario, right? If you've got a lot of injured people and one person has got, their throat slit and 15 other people have their legs broken and whatever, you can save those 15 people with broken legs. The person with the throat slit, this is assuming there's your limited resources, because that's usually the scenario, right? So you triage, right, and you say, look, this person can't be saved with what we have, so we save 15 instead of saving one.
Makes sense,
right? Because if we try to save that one person, the likelihood is 15 people might die. So it's that old ethical question of, which way do you switch the tracks, to the family of 4 or to the friend that's on the track by himself?
Right.
So that's the equation that basically goes through the head of the firefighter going through doing structure protection, is, can this structure be saved? And you make that decision at a glance. You look and you say, it can or cannot. Okay. If it cannot, you put a flag and you say, do not enter on the driveway or whatever. If it can, you go and maybe you throw some chairs off a deck. Maybe you take down a tree that's near the house, but it's only one tree, so it takes you 2 seconds to take it down. Maybe you clip some sprinklers onto the eaves of the house and you turn them on and you leave. And when you basically, and that's, now I'm just telling you what structure protection looks like. So yeah, so you go, you do that, and then you leave and you wait for the fire to come through. And the fire comes through, and then as soon as the fire comes through, you basically return to what can only be described as a smoky hellscape. And you hope that the structures that you put your protection on are still standing. And then you go and you put out any fires that are in, on, or around those structures that you tried to protect. And then you move on to the next as quickly as you can. Because you realize that you've got, dozens, if not hundreds of structures that you've got to go and prevent from catching fire. And if one is fully engulfed in flames, you don't put it out.
Let it go.
Yeah, because you can't. Because I think the thing that many people don't realize is that a house fire in isolation requires a tremendous amount of energy and resource to extinguish properly. Like, even if there's nobody in the house and you're just trying to put the fire out, like, you need thousands of gallons of water to put out a house. And so when you're talking about, you're in a truck that holds 500 gallons, you can't put out a house. And people are like, well, why can't you have more water? And you're like, well, you can, but if you put 2,000 gallons on that truck can't make it up certain roads. And so you might have a lot of water, but you might not be able to get to 80% of the places where you need to get.
That was one of the things I was wondering, is like, how do you, obviously there's no fire hydrants in the woods, right?
There's no fire hydrants in the woods.
You're strictly reliant on what you can transport in your truck.
Or on your back. It's an important thing to remember that in a lot of cases, especially in the wildland firefighter world, we're not talking about like structure protection in and around houses, but like out in the wild, fires do not get extinguished with water. They get extinguished with shovels, axes, chainsaws, and more fire. Your goal in a wildland fire setting is to remove fuel. Whereas in any other scenario where you're thinking of extinguishing a fire, you think of it as removing the heat by adding water. But in the wildland setting, you do not have that ability. You can, if you can carry, at most 15 gallons of water on your back, 25 gallons of water on your back, and you do quite often. I mean, you can imagine that's not going to put out a forest. That's going to extinguish a couple of embers here and there and cool off some soil so you can get back to work of removing it. And so you carry what water, you transport what water you can, but realize that the further away you get from those resources, the less you can transport. And the work that you do is not anymore extinguishing a fire, it's removing its fuel. So that happens literally by shoveling, digging down to dirt. That's the job. The job of a wildland firefighter is primarily digging a line from A to B down to dirt, because dirt don't burn.
This is true.
And the bigger the fire, the wider the line needs to be.
So you're just digging trenches, essentially.
Effectively, you're digging trenches. They don't have to be deep. They just have to be down to dirt. They have to be down to what's called mineral soil. So you down past roots, from grasses and whatever, past, pine cones and pine needles, and you're just digging a trench across the landscape in an effort to remove fuel, so that way a fire cannot go from where it's burning to where it's not burning.
Fascinating.
Yeah. It's a hell of a game.
Sounds
awful. As a homeowner who lives in the woods, it's awful. As a firefighter who has been in the woods with a shovel and water on my back, it's kind of amazing to do. It's really exhausting. It's a tremendous amount of work. It's unparalleled in physical activity. I've never done anything so physically demanding in my life, because not only are you hiking, but you're hiking as fast as you can while you're digging with a bunch of shit on your back. So it's a full body, nonstop, intense aerobic and anaerobic exercise at the same time. So your heart rate goes from hey, I'm fine, everything's fine, to my head's going to explode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you do that, when you go out into the woods and have to dig your holes, are you teamed up with people so you don't get lost? Or I got to imagine, because you could probably get very easily turned around walking through just in a non-smoky wood, you can get easily turned around. I can imagine the woods that are fucking engulfed in flames and just smoke everywhere. Yeah,
there are some fundamental rules about what you do and how you go, and see if I can remember my LCES. So lookouts, communication, escape routes, and safety zones. Those are the first things you consider. So lookouts is you need to make sure that there are people stationed in a place that can see the fire, that they know, and that they can tell you what the fire is doing and communicate with you what the fire is doing. So you've got one or two people stationed in higher up, farther away places that can spot the direction of the fire, the direction of the winds, communications between them and the team on the ground, which is, some usually 6 to 9 people, depending upon what kind of squad's out there. And then your escape routes is that the team on the ground always has at least one way to get the heck out if something changes, if fuels change, if the wind changes. It's really the weather that you're concerned with, right? The ability to get out from where you are. So if you're on a road that only has one way out, and your truck is parked up there and you're down there digging line, you better make damn well sure that if the fire or the wind shifts, that you can get back to your truck and down that road fast enough that you don't get overcome by fire. And then the safety zones are kind of like an intermediate, an area within the active fire where you can go and deploy your shelter, which is basically a foil tarp and a little bit of hope. You can go and deploy your shelter in an area where if the fire does come through there, it's not going to be terrible. Maybe you're in a grassy field, a mowed lawn, a road. Well, you can't deploy in a road, because then if somebody's trying to do escape route, you get run over. So, a stream bed, things like that.
Sounds terrifying.
It's interesting. I've been in some. I guess what you could call some terrifying situations, actual like terrifying situations. And I've never actually been terrified by any of it, except in the wildland training that I did when it was time. And this is training. This wasn't even a real situation where it was time to deploy shelters as part of the training. So your training is basically you doing all the things I just described as fast as you can all day. And mind you, that an actual wildland firefighter out in the wild fighting fire is operating on a 16+ hour shift, 7 days straight for 2 weeks. Right. There's no break there. I mean, there are breaks, but there's no real break. Like, you don't get a chance to recover and chill. Like, you are full steam ahead all the time. So we're about 6.5, maybe 7 hours into our training, which is intense. It's a lot of hiking and digging and moving and cutting and slashing, etc. Power gardening, if you will. And then right when just about everybody in the group is as exhausted as they can possibly be, in our case, we had to run up a very steep incline in an effort to try to get to a spot fire, a fake spot fire, dig a line around it, and prevent it from reaching across where we were. And then immediately once we got to the top and started digging, the alert went out over the radio to deploy shelters. The fire was advancing. There was no escape. And so then you've got to leave what you just did, run to a safe zone, and then deploy your shelter, which consists basically of digging a hole for your face in the ground, and then pulling out your foil tarp, getting in it, lying down on the ground face first, and sucking dirt until the fire passes over you. Now, in this case, we were using practice shelters, which are not foil-lined tarps. They're just tarps, basically, right, in the shape of a body bag. And it was a 75-degree, beautiful sunny day out. And you go in those shelters and the temperature inside immediately rises, which is the inverse of what is supposed to happen because you're in a foil-lined thing that's preventing radiant heat from coming in. These practice shelters didn't. So long story short, which is not the case, but long story short is that was the most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life, because even though it was a practice drill, I immediately understood that in the real world, you could be deploying your shelter in any condition, and it does not matter how tired you are, and it does not matter where you're standing. If you don't get to a spot and get that shelter out in time, not only are you dead, but you're dead in like a really bad way.
Yeah.
Like taking a breath of 1,200-degree fire air as it, overcomes you is not cool.
It's the opposite of cool, actually.
It's the opposite of cool. And as a structural firefighter for years before I ever did any wildland stuff, it's like the exact opposite world. In structural firefighting, you are doing everything you can to be as protected as possible to enter into the fire. Like, you are literally suiting up to go into the fire. In this case, you are not suiting up to go into a fire. You're basically wearing pants and a long sleeve shirt with a hard hat and gloves. And that's it. You don't have any breathing protection. You wear safety glasses, I guess, but like there's no actual protection. And like even nowadays, like when you do, structural firefighting, like you get out of that house and the first thing that happens is they spray you down with a hose and your gear goes into a bag and you get decontaminated because, in the old days, we used to think it was cool to have dirty gear, but then, everybody started dying of cancer. So they stopped that practice. But wildland firefighting is not that. You spend 2 weeks covered in forest soot. And that's it. That's the job. It is.
And it's a job you volunteer for, correct? For the most part?
Some people get paid. I have volunteered because, well, why not? But yeah, people get paid. And people make a living out of it too. I mean, if and it's usually kids, man. Usually it's 18-year-olds who get trained, go out, go on some assignments. And if they're real into it, they can become, incident commanders and squad bosses and fire managers. And, there's a lot to do. I mean, if it hasn't burned, it will. So there's plenty of job out there for people who want to do what I just described.
Fascinating. It's terrifying, but it sounds better than sitting at a desk all day.
It can be better than sitting at a desk all day.
Although the idea of laying down on the ground with a foil blanket over me, waiting for a fire to come past over me and hope that I survive is, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you take the good with the bad, I guess.
Suppose.
It's the truth of the matter is that most often that shelter doesn't get deployed. In fact, I know some guys, and they've told me the stories of how, they've been doing this for 20 something years. One of the guys is the wildfire captain, or wildland captain here at my local fire department that I'm part of. 20 something years. He said he's never deployed his shelter. And the most scared he has ever been was the day where he thought he needed to. And it was the, oh crap, go to the safety zone, deploy, wait, abort, it's okay. And that was the closest. So, it's actually a rare event that you deploy this. And the shelter is exactly what it sounds like, dude. It's a last ditch. It's if every single option that you've got available to you has run its course, then you have this shelter.
Right.
Yeah.
Shelter. Shelter. Yeah, quotation marks.
In air quotes. Shelter. Well, I mean, it's saved lives. I mean, that's the thing that's crazy about it is this thing that I just described to you, this horrible little cocoon, has saved lives, lots of lives, because
it's crazy
in those situations. I mean, your ears get burned, your hair singes off, you get heat exhaustion, you probably pass out from smoke inhalation, you all sorts of, like, you don't come out of there going, hey, that was neat. You come out of there like needing to go to the hospital for a couple of weeks, but you come out of there,
right?
And that's the thing.
Yeah, it's better than the alternative.
This is a program, if this ever makes it to the podcast, this is a program I will never share with my mother or my girlfriend. Yeah, actually.
What do you mean if? This will make it to the podcast.
Okay. And then I will never share it with my mother or my girlfriend.
Fair enough. Skip episode 4.
Yeah. Whatever you do, skip that one. Because I don't want to have to try to explain away everything I said and say things like, no, it's fine. It's totally fine. I was exaggerating.
I'm trying to get ratings here.
Yeah, no, it's all just for show.
I was just fascinated by it. I've been watching it on the news and just knowing that you're so close to it and that you do what you do. I was like, I got so many questions.
Yeah. Yeah,
you've answered them. Good job.
Thanks. Hey, thanks.
So now what? The snow is hopefully gonna dampen it a little bit and hopefully stop it.
It probably won't stop it, but
slow it down.
It will hopefully reduce its activity enough that we can actually get like some progress made and slow it down, right? Because the goal, and it's hard to kind of understand, I guess, if you're not in it. The goal of a wildfire is not to necessarily put it out.
No, it's to contain it and let it burn itself out.
Exactly, right? You can't really put it out. So when you hear on the news that a wildfire has been contained by some percentage, what that means is that to some degree around the perimeter of the fire, there is a sufficiently cold and wide line that cannot burn, that will not burn, that even if the wind shift, even if something changes about the scenario, that line is contained. It's not going to go past here. And so when you hear a wildfire is 50% contained, that just means that 50% of the perimeter has some amount of line around it. So you can imagine the bigger the fire, 50% can be, miles, tens of miles, hundreds of miles of line that has been dug and gone over, and quite literally by bare hand. When you do something called cold trailing, is you're in that scenario and you're trying to create a cold, black, burnt line or something that the fire can't get through, you take your hand out of your glove and you run it across the soil. And if you feel something that burns your hand, it's too hot. And that's how you know. That's how you know it needs to be further cold. Didn't. Yeah. So in the case of the fires that are burning now, they're so large that containment is even hard to fathom, just the sheer length of the line that needs to exist. And in the case of a weather change like this, these fires are so big and they're so hot that this will not put them out. It needs to do this for like a month for the firefighters to just go, meh, we're good. We're going to take a step back.
Yeah.
You know, so we're expecting this to last 2 days, which hopefully saves the town of Estes Park, which is right now the biggest concern of one of the fires, the East Troublesome Fire. Estes Park is basically the little mountain town that is immediately at the entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park. And the fire has somehow managed to burn over many miles of high altitude tundra where there is little or no vegetation, Rocky Mountain peaks, literally, and it has somehow jumped across over that and then onto the other side into and through Rocky Mountain National Park, and has burned a large portion of Rocky Mountain National Park, which is in and of itself kind of sad. And has, as of last night, stopped at about 1.5 miles from the western edge of Estes Park. And from what I understand, not being there, it was basically like a last stand. It was a surge of firefighters came basically in an effort to dig every line, drop every water, protect every structure on the edge of that town to keep it from coming into that town in time for the weather to change, so that way they could breathe a breath. And
right.
It seems like they did it. It seems like the town of Estes Park was spared by 1 mile or so.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. So the weather that's coming in now is hopefully going to continue that, because the wind shifted, so the fire is now blowing back on itself, which is effectively good news,
right?
Because there's less or no fuel back in on itself. So, because the real thing about any of this stuff is that these fires burn, and you think of this perimeter of fire and it burns outward, and the stuff that it leaves behind is basically burnt fuel. And as it burns forward and the winds are pushing it forward, the flames are not just burning straight up and down, they're leaning into more fuel because it's being blown by the wind like a blowtorch. And all that stuff, all those embers are getting stirred and blown up and out in front of the fire and dropping embers miles in front of the fire. And that turns into a fire. And then that creates a whole other circumstance of convection, and it actually creates its own weather where that fire ahead of the fire starts drawing in air, which accelerates the fire, which then connects it to the fire that it created, and then it exacerbates itself by kind of feeding off of itself. So this wind shift that occurred last night is tremendous, because it sort of like put up a big hand and said, no, fuck you, return to sender.
That's crazy.
That's why I have a metal roof, so that way when my house burns to a crisp, that the only thing left will be my metal roof.
Your metal roof.
Mm-hmm.
You can hide underneath it in a foil blanket.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I've got the cat carriers, and I've got a bag, and I've got, papers. I know where the things are that I want to take, and I can be out of here in less than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I only have one road out. So if that road gets cut off, then I sort of have a plan.
Fair. Well, last question, and then we can move on.
Sure.
So, based on everything you've told me, so when you see the videos of these giant jumbo jets dumping whatever, what is that water? Because it's red, or is it some sort of fire retardant?
It is often water, but the red stuff is basically it's a chemical that's mixed with water. And it's red so you can see it. And the chemical the chemical that's in there is it's called a surfactant, and it's basically a soap, if you will. And all it does is increase the wetness of water. Water evaporates quickly, and it runs off of things quickly.
Right.
And so if you dump a bucket of water versus a bucket of retardant, the water will run off, evaporate, soak in quick, and the retardant will cling and hang on and not run off and moisten the material below it for longer. So it's basically like a thinned foam, if you will.
So that answers my question. So I suppose the purpose of those jet planes is not to put out the fire, but to create a line to stop it from. Huh.
Yeah. So and that's not always the case. Sometimes they're putting water on fire, right? Sometimes they can get into an area where, you've got a flame front. We can line the jet up. The terrain is such that we can cool this spot down. But those jets, the bigger the jet, the redder the stuff. That's just creating line. It's basically doing what I described as far as digging a line to mineral soil.
Right.
First, it's doing that in order to slow or stop the fire spread beyond that line. When you see helicopters in particular, or even smaller planes, but helicopters especially, helicopters are doing water drops, and they're doing water drops specifically to cool spots that are on fire. Because a helicopter generally, especially the smaller ones, does not have enough water to be able to create a line.
Right.
It has enough water to be able to cool a spot. So, you got to think of these things as like, I guess, spots and lines, right? If the landscape, even though it's not, but if the landscape were a perfect plane, all we're trying to do is draw a shape around the thing with dots and lines.
It's crazy.
It is crazy.
It is crazy. I watched the footage of like 747s flying so low to the ground, just dumping this. Like, wow,
yeah,
it's gonna be fucking nuts.
There's here comes some really good names. That's called a VLAT, very large air tanker.
It's a great name for it.
You know what? But there's also the LAT.
It's just a large
air tanker. Yeah.
Is there a MAT?
No, there's not. No, they stopped using that particular acronym on the smaller ones. There's seats. There's LATs, there's VLATs. Seats is a single engine air tanker. So basically, that's the small one.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of
this. They just didn't want to go with SAT.
Right. There's a couple
MAT, LAT.
Well, but here's the thing, right? People often ask the questions like, how do you come up with these names? No one sat down and designed these names. No one sat down like years ago and with a spreadsheet and went, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to define all of the possibilities that exist, and we're going to name them all, and they're all going to be great. No, you started off with a fire that we should. I got an idea. We should get a plane that can hold some water, that can drop some water in this area. That would be really helpful. Yeah, let's do that. What is it? Oh, it's just a single engine air tanker. Yeah, okay, cool. So we'll call it a seat. And then no one ever thought that a 747 would be flying 150 feet above the freaking mountains, dropping tens of thousands of gallons of fire retardant across a landscape.
Yeah.
If you had asked firefighters 30, 40 years ago if that was ever going to happen, they'd be like, of course not. Fires don't burn that bad. We would never need that. So the names that came out of these things were like, well, we're going to need a bigger air tanker. Well, we'll get a large one.
Or a very large one.
We're going to need an even bigger. What are we going to do? We should get a very large air tanker. Like it's like, honestly, like the next one is going to be probably like the SVLAT or SVLAT. Super very large, that's where we are.
I wonder why they didn't go with extra large, the ELAT.
I don't know.
With very, it's very odd.
Extra very large will be the next one. So EVLAT. I don't know, dude. And that's the thing. They didn't go with anything other than because what do we do next? Well, it's clearly very large,
right?
Like, what are we going to do? We can't make the largest because apparently we keep going. It's that's the scenario we're in. It keeps going. these fires, and now I'm going to get a slight bit preachy here. These fires that are burning in Colorado, the fires that are burning in California, in Oregon and Washington, the fires that burned in Australia earlier this or last year are unprecedented in any scenario. And people will, things happen. The fires are natural. Yeah, they absolutely are natural. But in the course of human history, no fires have been this large, this fast, and this numerous at the same time.
Well, the West has been incredibly dry.
Incredibly dry.
It's been crazy. The drought out there is just nuts.
It is the case where I think we were texting the other day and I told you about the humidity outside.
Yeah, 3%. It's ridiculous.
So right now it's 78% humidity outside, but that's also because it's 6 degrees. Right? Because it's just so that cold. Inside my house, it is currently 1% humidity.
Sounds glorious.
It's one. In fact, I'm looking at on my desk here. I've got a little temperature sensor thing that's got a bunch of remotes, and one of them, the humidity is so low it reads LL because it's off the scale. Like, I don't even know what that means because isn't 0 just the end? But no, the sensor is going, nope, too dry, can't, don't know how.
Should invest in a humidifier.
Actually, what I do is I take a pan, an aluminum pan of water, and I put it on my wood stove, and I just let it sit there, and it kind of gently boils off
some steam, some humidity,
and it'll raise it by about 5-10%, which is nice because otherwise this is a static cling and static shock box at this point.
Yeah.
So since we've been talking, the temperature outside has gone down about 2 or 3 degrees. It has now started to snow properly. There we are. So that's good.
All right. Yeah. I'm glad you're getting some snow, some humidity. Hopefully it protects your little enclave there for a little bit. Or for a long bit.
For now. It's just a matter of time. It's the equivalent of living on the beach. It really is.
Right.
It's if you live on the shore and you get angry when the water rises, then you're a fool. Because the water gonna rise. Forest gonna burn.
Water gonna rise.
Forest gonna burn, ocean gonna rise. Like it's just that's where we are. There's no way around that. And so you build your house in a forest, gonna burn.
Yeah, I guess. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah. Forest doesn't care.
It's true. I just guess living in the Northeast, you don't hear very much about wildfires up this way.
No, but when they do, they often, and they do. There's plenty of wildfire throughout the country, but they don't.
Right.
They don't
burn to that extent.
No.
Right.
No. That's the thing. I mean, again, this is a confluence of events, right? So there's, I think actually the problem has diminished lately because most of the trees are dead, but over the last 15, 20 years, there's been an invasive beetle problem. And so a large swaths of forest have been impacted by this beetle, bark beetle, that goes and kills trees, basically. Burrows into the bark, it eats up the bark, kills the tree remains standing and it's dead. And in certain areas, in particular where these fires up north are burning, there are huge stands of dead standing pines. Huge stands, like miles and miles and miles, up entire mountainsides of just dead trees. Combined with years of drought. So now they're dry, dead pine trees.
Right.
Combined with weather events that, and this is still something I don't like. Okay, so growing up on Long Island, you're on Long Island, we're used to the occasional tropical storm or nor'easter, and then every once in a while a hurricane.
Yep.
Right? These are things that come. And, most people who live in that area know that 75-mile-an-hour winds is a hurricane.
Right.
And then beyond. So Category 1 hurricane starts at 75 mile an hour. Winds in the last couple of days up north have been sustained at 70 miles an hour, gusting to 80 and 90 miles an hour. There's no hurricane here. That's just the wind being windy.
Right.
It's not a storm. The storm didn't roll through. There's no storm. It was just freaking wind at that area for days. So like you combine all those things. I mean, you can imagine it's a freaking blowtorch. And it was like, I know, like intellectually you know certain things, but you don't really know it. You don't really understand it until you, and I guess experience it a little bit. And so I first move up here. I look around. I go, okay, there's a lot of fuel up here. Ooh, fire danger. Blah blah blah. Okay. Well, then I actually got out into the woods with a chainsaw and I started cutting up and removing fuel, and I create piles that I can then remove and send away. And the very first time I created a pile, it was a very big pile. It was like a 5x5 pile, 5 foot by 5 foot by 5 foot tall, right? That is a very, very large bonfire. Like very large.
Yeah.
Like that's a significantly good bonfire to have. And I had and I still do, dozens of those piles. And if you look at the forest, it looks like I haven't done anything but make piles. Like nothing really looks different.
Right.
And it occurred to me in that moment, like, oh, that is a lot of fuel. Oh, there's a lot of fuel. There's more fuel than anyone can do anything about. Thanks for joining us on today's podcast.